So, you have a project in mind. Maybe you're thinking of creating a business. Maybe you already work for a company and have been assigned a new project to create. Maybe you're a freelancer and are just thinking of a new project for whatever freelancing thing you do. Maybe you're creative and you're thinking up of how to ensure success in your next endeavor. Whatever it is, the point is, you're here because you want to ensure that you have checked all of the information that is available out there on the internet for free and informed yourself in preparation for that project that you are embarking on, which is great. And I'm so glad you're doing that. I'm so glad. I love people who take responsibility for the things they do. So if you're here, the main question on your mind right now is, how do I make sure that my project is the best that it can possibly be? How do I increase the chances of this project or endeavor that I'm embarking on succeeding? Well, I'm glad you asked. But first, before we begin, let's get to know each other a little bit more. So, hi there, my name is Maria. I'm so happy to see you here on Life Spirals. I used to be an architect in the past, then I transitioned into a freelance brand designer, which then transitioned me into brand consulting and marketing simultaneously. And what I do now is essentially I am a startup consultant and I structure and set up systems in startups pre-MVP launch, / help them along the way and guide them after they have launched the MVP, kind of oversee them and ensure that all of the processes that have been set up before they launched, we launched, are actually continuing to run smoothly, and any people that get onboarded actually understand what is happening in the startup. So if your quest is to create a good project, you are right to ask a person with an architectural education who currently actively works in startups. But I also want to get to know you as well. So if you would like to, please do leave a little bit of an introduction down in the comments below this video, because I do genuinely want to know what people are getting up to, what especially good humans are creating in this planet, what their intentions are. And just so you know, I have already been putting out quite a few free resources, guidebooks and things like that, which you can find down in the tab link below this video, as well as have created a Discord community to support young entrepreneurs, creatives, and just once again, people embarking on projects, especially if those projects are aligned with what is considered, I guess, the highest path of humanity. So anything aligned with the Sustainability Agenda 2030, which the UN has put out essentially, which you can find out more about in the previous video. But yeah, the Discord community for that is also in the links down below. So once again, introduce yourself in the comments, tell me a little bit about what it is you're doing, why you're doing it, what your general goal and aim is. Maybe tell me a little bit about what your vision for the best path for humanity is. I would be very interested to hear that. And if you would like to, check out the free resources in the link below and do join the Discord community, because I will be putting out a lot more resources as we go along. So, welcome to part 2 of the series. If you haven't seen part 1, go and watch it. I'm gonna link it up here. But now, in this video, I want to actually get down to the creative and design process of creating a new project or product to ensure success, as I have already stated in the intro. And the structure that I'm about to give you is essentially my bread and butter. Like, this is how I pretty much run everything in my life and ensure absolute success in everything I do, is because pretty much any endeavor that I embark upon, this system is so ingrained in my brain after architecture school that basically any action I take in my life is backed up by a mental process that runs through all of the steps that I'm once again about to give you. And Just saying, but thus far it hasn't failed me. So let's get to creating a design project. So first of all, don't run away if your project doesn't seem to involve design. If, let's say, you're creating some kind of a business or a startup related to finance or economics, because trust me, there's a design process in basically everything. The design process, especially the systems that are used in design thinking, are currently being implemented absolutely anywhere, from tech to finance to law to even governments. So once again, this kind of systematized way of ideating for a project is absolutely essential because it is at the core of basically everything that surrounds you. So without further ado, I will just jump right into it. So this, let's say, exercise is something that optimally would be done in a format of some kind of a presentation, but you can also just list all of the things that I'm about to talk to you about in somewhere in your notebook, maybe create like a Notion template or something of the sort, and fill in for your own self, for your own project, for your own idea or innovation or whatever it is you're doing. And so this process of design thinking starts with the first step, which is creating a brief for your project. And I will leave a template for a project brief down in the top link and in the Discord below once again, but I'll just verbally explain it in this video. So what the brief is essentially a series of questions, I guess, a series of determining factors for a project. And the very, very initial brief is usually something that a client essentially provides to the facilitator of the project. And if you are yourself the client of your project, so if you are the person that is paying for the project yourself, you're just like creating it on your own accord, then you're essentially, once again, your own client. So you're the one to actually fill out and answer the questions in the brief. And first of all, the brief always outlines the aim of the project. So the general idea, intention, goal of the project. Even better if you can actually break all of those into separate categories. So what is the aim of the project? What is the intention behind the project? And what is the particular measurable goal of the project? And by a measurable goal, I mean something like how much ROI, so return on investment, you are intending to receive, how many users for the project you're looking to acquire, how many leads you're looking to acquire if it's like a marketing project, how much revenue you're looking to make as a minimum, how many answers you're looking to get for some question that maybe your project is inquiring, so on and so forth. So something that can be quantified in numbers is the goal of the project, and then the aim is something that is essentially the purpose of your project. So the intention is also the purpose, but the intention is more with what intent you're creating the project, and the aim is kind of what is the expected output of the project. Then next, as I have already prepared you for this step in the previous video, you should have separated out for yourself who are the clients of your project, so the people that are actually giving money to either receive the results of the project or to receive the product at the end of the project, or that the project facilitates, so on and so forth. Who are the users of the project, so the people that will actually be using it as an instrument or a tool, or who are the viewers of the projects alternatively. So users and viewers can kind of be interchangeable because, for example, if your project is a creative artwork of sorts, then people might not necessarily be directly interacting with it, so not directly using it, but they can be viewing it. So, essentially the viewers, users, the same, but the client is separate. And then who are the sponsors of the project. So who are the people actually backing the process of creation of the project? So whereas the clients are the people giving you money for the result of the project, the sponsors are those who are providing you the finances for the project with an expectation of a particular output. And so, especially if you have sponsors, you need to define for yourself, especially what the goal of the project is in terms of the output. And so, once again, how much return on investment it will provide to your sponsors, for example, is a very, very important step. This feeds into another aspect of the brief, which is called the project scope. So the project scope is essentially the deliverables of the project. So in the project scope, you once again essentially outline what you will be delivering as an output of the project. So preferably it is something that can also be measured or rated or ranked or quantified in some way, shape or form. But once again, because I'm also talking to potentially creative people where, the value of artwork, well, technically can be quantified still in like the amount of sales for the tickets and so on and so forth. But I understand that kind of thinking is a bit too corporate for us creative people. Yes, I am creative as well. I love business, but I'm an artist too. So don't get me wrong here. But so if, for example, your project is creating, your deliverables can still be like the number of pieces that you're putting out, the amount of ground that you will be covering, the expected amount of, once again, viewers for whatever work it is you are creating, the amount of attention that your work will acquire. That is also a deliverable. Next, you need to also include in your brief the constraints and assumptions. So it speaks for itself. The constraints are the limitations that you might have in the process of the creation of the project. And the assumptions are things that you have assumed to be true prior to embarking on the project. And those can really be anything from like the resources that you have available to yourself to the amount of people that could be interested in your project, like literally anything at this point is pretty much an assumption. So you have to state and be truthful with yourself about what are the limitations, what are the capacities, and what are the assumptions that you're making that you are willing to admit to being wrong about when, bit comes to pat, whatever the phrase is. Then next, you need to outline for yourself the success criteria for your project as well. So this is another series of assumptions, but this time, I guess, on a more positive side of the story about what to you would be indicators of actual success of the project that you have created. So independent of what you would be measuring the success in, still outline for yourself, preferably in, once again, a quantifiable manner, what you would expect to define success in your endeavor. And last but not least, the brief always also includes the budget and the time frame for the project. So the budget is how much finances you have available for your project if it requires finances, which in a capitalist society it almost certainly does. And the time frame is essentially when is the deadline for your project. And hear me out, especially if you're creative. I know that setting a time frame on art sounds ridiculous, but it is a very, very well-known wisdom of all of the successful creatives in this world that limitations breed creativity. So if you actually want to have a successful output of your project, even if it is creative artwork, set yourself a precise time frame for whatever it is you're doing. Set yourself deadlines for each stage of the project. Not necessarily at this initial briefing stage, but at this initial briefing stage, you have to have some kind of a time frame, at least generally. So once again, as I have already stated in the previous video, since you're going into this on some kind of an inspiration, on some kind of an initiation and initiative. And especially if you have watched the previous video, you have a general idea of what it is you will actually be doing. Now, after you have actually listed and answered all of the questions from the brief, it is time for proper initial ideation. Now here, I quite frankly cannot give you much guidance because there are so many various types of projects that could be happening out there that you, my amazing crowd of people, could be making, but you almost certainly at this point have some kind of ideas. So at this point, after the brief, is where you drop down all of those initial ideas that you have. And the key thing is to just not get attached to any of those ideas in any way. Like, just drop them down and leave them there as like initial inspiration, and do not attach to any one of your initial concepts. Okay? Because next, what we will do is actually go into the process of detailed study of the environment, essentially, around the project. So the environment around the project, once again, will depend on the type of project that you're creating, but this is where architectural terms will have to be applied, and I will elaborate on them as we go along. But you start with essentially what in architecture we call the site context study. So the site context, obviously, in architecture means studying the actual site, the area around, like the city, the local governance, the local area, once again, around the building that you're creating, around the project that you're creating. And so now we take that idea of the site study and extrapolate that onto other fields and other areas. Let's say that you're creating a startup that is an app of some sort. So for your case, the site study would be the study of the general field of the app market. So whether it is the iTunes, the Play Store, whatever it is, just like the general context surrounding the environment, surrounding anything related to mobile applications. If you are creating, once again, an artwork of some sorts, then your site study could potentially be studying the general art market, especially in the niche that you are aiming to enter. So the general context, the history, the ideas, the prevalent, most popular, current people and artists that operate in that area. I think you get the idea. And then after studying the site context, you go into actually studying the building. Once again, this is a term from architecture which we then take and extrapolate onto other fields and other areas of business. So as the building in architecture is essentially the system that exists prior to you creating your project, we can now take that, and when we apply that to other areas, you can look at it as the study of the tools, systems, and mechanisms that your customers, your users, have prior to you introducing them to your product. So studying what tools, things, operations those people do before they have received the fruits of your labor, the results of your project. And this part of the design thinking process is essentially a way to measure up, a way to at least prepare to measure up how much of an impact your project will be having, which is also a very, very important and crucial step in creating an actually successful project, because a successful project in the general sense is typically a project that has impact, that carries some kind of impact, that improves people's lives in some major way. So in order to understand that you are actually improving people's lives in some way, you need to know how have the people, how have the users, the clients, so on and so forth, been living before your project, so that later, once your project is actually created, or at least its MVP, so the minimal viable product, has been created and released, you can actually measure how much of an impact it has, as you will be informed of what is the before, and then you will be able to see and take note of what is the after your project. And the next step is doing a precedent study. So it is essentially a study of the cases and examples that already exist out there that have been done by somebody else before you. That might either be similar projects as a whole, or could just be projects that you can source and grab inspiration from, or that are in some way, shape, or form relevant to your own personal project. So those are all precedents. And in the precedent study, you essentially look at, first of all, how is that particular example or precedent actually relevant to your project? So see and mark the relation, and then look at how that project has been accomplished and what useful lessons you can extract from that other person's example, from that other project's example. And then, after all of those studies have been conducted, what you want to do is go back to the brief. I know, you have already have done the brief, why we're gonna go there? No, you have to, trust me. You go back to the brief, and now with the new information that you have just discovered, reassess your brief. Because now, at this point, if you have done your research properly, you have a much better sense of all of the criteria that are involved in your project, the actual risks and assumptions and limitations of your project, who are the actual users and clients of your project. Those are all things that you must and absolutely must have gained more insight on after having done the research. And if you don't have any new insights about any aspects of the brief, that means that your research has not been thorough enough. Just trust me on this. Because in the research process, you always find something new. So if you haven't discovered anything new that you haven't already marked down in your brief, go and search more until you find out something that challenges your initial brief, that challenges your initial assumptions. And then go and reiterate on the brief that you have previously created with a more detailed, a more nuanced, and a more accurate brief. And now the second brief is the actual brief for your project. Or is it? Because guess what? This is all a reiteration process. So once again, never get attached to anything you do in any of the project creation steps. And if you ever discover anything new, anything that you don't know about before that is inaccurate in your brief, just do the work and always go back to the brief and redo it, even if it means redoing it 1,000 times. Make sure that your brief is nailed down, because later on, while you're doing your project management and actual project development, trust me, you will want to make sure that your brief is spot on. And now that you have done the brief and all of those previous assessments and studies, it is time for actual informed ideation, where, once again, you can kind of look back on your initial ideas, but because we don't want to attach to them in any way, shape, or form, I highly recommend that at this point in your project, you try to generate new ideas. And in general, as you go along throughout the whole project, consistently attempt to generate ideas and drop them down on some kind of an inspiration board. Maybe have like a collection, a file somewhere, like a Figma file, where you drop down all of the ideas that you come up with as you go along with the project. But once again, at this step, you go through the actual informed ideation process, where after all of the lessons that you have extracted from all of the information that you have searched for, you can actually generate ideas that are backed by some kind of valid information in your studies. So the next step is what we in architecture call zoning. And once again, as I have with the previous steps, let's extrapolate that onto other types of projects and other niches and other businesses and other kinds of projects that can be possibly made. So zoning in architecture is where you take the facility, so the building, the land, the garden, whatever it is that you're working on, and you split it into general areas of purpose. So here you start actually considering the users of your project. So in architecture, it's obviously very simple because you have a physical building that you split into zones, that you split into like with little lines. You look at the grid of the building and you assess what would be possibly the best ways to arrange the flow throughout the building, but that is for buildings. When we take that into other types of projects, it would essentially be the process of looking at the major parts with which the user of the project will be interacting and ensuring that they are arranged properly. I really hope that this makes sense. So in the case of creating a tangible physical product, the zoning of your project would be separating the project into steps of where the person orders the product or goes to buy the product, where the person actually has the product, the different aspects of the user actually interacting with the product. So that could also involve the marketing as a separate zone, the packaging as a separate zone, and then the product itself as the separate zone. There could be different zones within the product itself, where like if a product is multifaceted and has different uses, those could also all be outlined as zones. And then the actual end of use of the product is a separate zone in itself. Just like in buildings, we have the waste utilization facility always as a necessary consideration. Similarly, at the end of any physical product, there is an end of use process that has to be involved. So how will the user actually be getting rid of the product is a separate zone of consideration in itself. So all of the things that have to be considered about your project or your product, separate those into zones of consideration is essentially what the step is. Then if your project is in regards to marketing somebody else's product, then the zones of the marketing project would be the client acquisition, client introduction, that would be one zone, for example. Doing the research for the marketing, that would be a different zone of the project. Then actual onboarding of the clients or of the members of the project would be a different zone. Then the actual creation of the marketing strategy would be a different zone. Doing the user testing could be a different zone in itself, and so on and so forth. I think the marketers will get the memo because, at least from the information that I've seen, marketing education is actually not that far-fetched from any other design thinking process education. So you should have this by now, but it's like in general, marketing is split into pretty well-defined steps of actual client customer acquisition and then user acquisition, user of your like retention, raising the interest, and then like collecting their leads and then utilizing their leads properly. Like those are all the different zones and steps in the marketing project process. So the steps, once again, will essentially be the zones for you. Then in the case of a digital app, the explanation of the process of zoning could be a little bit more difficult, and you might have to actually think a bit deeper about what is actually relevant to your particular case scenario. But for an app, for example, the zoning could be the actual marking out of all of the core features of the app or of the software that you're developing. That would essentially be the zoning in your case. Or once again, you could look at zoning as the user process of interaction with the app acquisition, download process, utilization strategy, and then like what the output would be of the user using that particular software or app. And then with art, it would probably be the most difficult to extrapolate onto, because in art, your zoning could be anything from genuinely just zoning out the concept. So, just like taking a canvas and like literally mapping out how the art piece will look. That could be your zoning, like what messages you might want each piece of the artwork, each aspect of the artwork to carry. That could be your zoning. Or once again, the zoning could be the facility around the display of the artwork that you're creating. That could also be zoning in itself. But I think with all of the examples that I have given so far, you should have a pretty good sense of what I mean when I say zoning. So take whatever case it is that you have of a project that you're creating and try to apply all of the things that I have just said about zoning onto your project. And once again, just essentially split your project into comprehensive steps, stages, zones of study, zones of exploration, zones of design, zones of attention. And why was all of this necessary? Because the zoning leads directly into the user experience considerations, which in the software development world is called the UX, so the user experience UX. So the user experience consideration process is essentially you looking back at who your end user and audience will be, the end consumer of the project or of the product, putting yourself in their shoes, really switching on that muscle of empathy and attempting to optimize the zoning, so all of the steps that you have done previously, to ensure that the experience of the person, of the audience, of the individual, of the consumer at the end of the project is as good and as high quality as it can possibly be. Or if your project doesn't strive for high quality, but it strives to derive some kind of emotion, some kind of attachment, some kind of effect on the user experience considerations are essentially the process of ensuring that the effect that you want your project to have on the user happens in the way that it should, that the impact that you're seeking to have on the user is there, through, once again, empathizing and deeply studying the user first and foremost. And then that empathy can be applied in many different ways depending on, once again, what project you have. So in interior architecture, for example, we usually use this thing called the compatibility matrix, where we take all of the zones from the previous step, we'll take all of the rooms, all of the aspects of the facility, and see how the user path through all of those aspects of the facility is compatible or incompatible with other aspects of the user path. It is a very, very similar process to what is done in software. And then in physical, tangible products, you have to kind of, once again, think a bit creatively to extrapolate that concept onto it. But essentially in these two steps, we're just ensuring that the user experience is as flowing, as easy as possible, or evokes the emotions and the effects that you want to evoke from the user. And so now that you at least should have some kind of an idea of what experience it is that you want your user to have, you're ready to embark on the study of the details of your project. So as we keep going down the line of this project concept creation stages, it is progressively becoming more and more difficult for me to explain how each stage would apply to all of the different projects that can possibly exist in the world. So I'm really, really hoping that the people that are watching this are sane and wise enough to understand what I mean when I say it. But the detail research is essentially you looking into all of the different details and features and components that the different zones of your project will require. So whether those are information, whether those are physical details, whether those are people in the organization, just this stage is essentially you just going in detail on what it is you're actually creating and going into detail from the user perspective of what the user would require, what details, what features, what facilities your user would require to have that optimal experience that you have outlined in the previous step. And after you have actually decided on all of the details and the features that you would like your project to include, is where you're ready for the actual kind of, not even ideation at this point, but the actual first initial stages of the proper design process for your project. And at this stage, you are essentially ready to create your first initial prototype or at least the concept for your first prototype, where now you know the general zones of what would have to be included in the project, you know everything around the project, you know the users of the project, and you also now know what would be the details and the features included within the project and within the different zones of the project. So now that you have essentially prepared all of these building blocks, at this stage, what you're doing is you're taking all of the building blocks that you have created on the previous stages and combining them together to create some kind of a first initial prototype concept. And from this point onwards, the next stages is essentially an infinite loop of refinement, improvement, and reiteration. So this is essentially where we go into Scrum and Agile development, which are some really, really cool terms that I think everybody should study, independent on whether you work in software, in startups, or you're an artist. Just trust me, you want to get into Scrum because it is such a useful process for any endeavor, once again, in your work or in your life. And if I was to explain the Scrum and Agile development process shortly, it is the process of coming up with a hypothesis, creating something, testing the hypothesis, collecting the results, analyzing the results, and going back to your starting point of creating a different hypothesis. Or if the results have been successful and have matched the initial hypothesis, proceeding on to the next stages of development of the project that you are creating. So, as I have just shown, it is essentially just an infinite loop of repetition until you have nailed some kind of a hypothesis or an idea, and then carrying on to go to a different sprint, as it is called, of hypothesis, and then testing the hypothesis until you have some kind of a success, or until you have feedback that you are expecting or desiring. Then also a very, very important step is looking at the regulations related to your project and ensuring that all of the technical aspects and features that you have just implemented are actually allowed by the different regulations and jurisdictions that are applicable to your particular project and endeavor. And then going back to, once again, coming up with, oh, but maybe we can add this. Oh, let's see if the regulations allow this. Oh yeah, they do if you do this, that, and that, and that. Oh, okay, how can we do this, that, Oh, we can do it through like these technical features. Oh, okay, so if we implement these technical features, what will be the outcome on the project? What will be the result? It will be this. Okay, so what does that lead us to? It leads us to the fact that our initial assumption, our initial idea was kind of false, but you know what, we succeeded in these aspects. So let's keep what succeeded and let's go back and reiterate and try again on the things that didn't succeed. And so, yeah, it's an infinite loop of just research, testing, research, testing, research, testing, until you actually have something that is usable, that actually looks like a product, or that looks like a comprehensive project. And do you remember how we created that brief at the start? This is where the brief comes back in. Because to not get stuck in this loop of constant reiteration, every time you reiterate, you go back to the brief to check out if you have met the criteria, the ideas, the assumptions, and all of the things that you have set out in the brief. And once your project actually matches the requirements of the brief, the ideas and the concepts that you have come up with, the brief requiring, that is when your project is more or less ready. And so once this ideation and initial testing stage actually meets the criteria and the concept set out by the brief, is when you're ready to actually do your final design proposition and start preparing for actually making the MVP, the minimum viable product. So the MVP, the minimum viable product, is essentially the first product, the first output that you will actually be willing to put out there into the world for others to see, use, and try. And that you can actually have some hope to have some kind of a positive impact or effect on other people, which in itself, is in a way success. So there we go. At the final design stages, honestly, it is once again very highly dependent on what project it is you're creating, but for most of the projects that I have at least worked with, I tend to recommend to not get too attached to really, really polishing the final design of the minimum viable product. Because once again, it is the minimum viable product. The core aim of all of this is to just like put something that more or less works out there, just to see some kind of feedback, just to get some kind of actual real user testing of the project that you have created. So don't get too stuck on the final stages of the design. Don't try too hard to overly polish it. Just make sure that it meets all of the criteria. It is usable. It does consider the users within it. It has all of the small technical detail that is required for it to operate. And just launch it. And see what happens. Take the feedback and then go back into the loop. Go right back into that Scrum and Agile development loop to then, now informed by your actual physical real product and the feedback that you're getting on the real product, be even more well informed and go back and keep reiterating, keep designing. And this is why I call this channel Life Spirals, because all you do is spiral from here on out. And then once you're tired of spiraling yourself is when you try to hire other people to do all of the spiraling, so the development of the project for you. So there we go. That is that for now. Once again, you can find more resources in the Discord server. I will be putting out more guidebooks and also linking different libraries of information sources, and in general, just, essentially whatever information I find, I just try to bring it together, optimize it, and give it to you guys. So yeah, just if you want to get some cool, good, free resources and you also like a nice guidebook, then yeah, go to the Discord, go to the top link, check out all of the resources that I'm providing down below. And also, if you would like to support this process of acquiring, optimizing, and sharing information on how to improve your projects, your creative work, your business, I do also have a Patreon down below, just saying. And I would really appreciate some support through the Patreon. So, just if you want to buy me a coffee or something, that would be very, very nice and much appreciated. So for now, just have a nice day. Once again, I'm so glad you have joined us here. And yeah, just keep spiraling and enjoying your life while you do so.